Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Mooney. I'm the project coordinator of the Maximizing Governance project here at OCASI, and I'd like to welcome you to our fourth webinar of the Maximizing Governance project, Risk Management, How to Identify, Analyze, and Monitor Risk. Your facilitator today will be Chris Govern, co-executive director of Management Advisory Service. I'd like to make sure that everyone can hear us. So if you can, could you please click the button to raise your hand, and I will see it in the attendees window of the webinar software. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the question box during the presentation. We will have a few breaks to answer them. Anything else, you can send email during or after the webinar to eMooney, M-O-O-N-E-Y, at ocasi.org. And the recording will be available after the webinar. One more thing is that the slide deck is available for download from the webinar software. It will also be available on the OCASI Maximizing Governance website. I'm going to turn things over to Chris right now. Chris, thank you very much for being here today. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Great to be with everyone this morning. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. We're going to talk today about risk management, which is one of the core governance functions. If you think about it, the job of the board is to ensure that you have a sustainable organization, that it's achieving its mission. Managing the risks around the organization, sustainability, and around the mission are critical functions that the board has to be able to manage. And it's one of the places in the boards that I deal with, it is the area where boards tend to rate themselves the lowest, where they have the least comfort that they're doing the job that they should be. And I think the reason for that is that boards tend to approach risk management in a very piecemeal fashion. So what we're going to talk about today is how you kind of look at it from in a very systematic way. And what we're going to look at is a couple of things. We're going to sort of define risk and risk management. We're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about how you identify, analyze, and manage risks. Then we're going to pull it all together in a risk management framework, which will be a tool that you can use in the organization to do this. And then we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the role of the board and the role of the staff when it comes to risk management. So we think about what is risk. The first bullet point there is a nice dictionary definition with lots of big words. And the second bullet point is really, risk is the possibility of something bad happening, is a very simple way to think about it. If you think about it, it's a pretty simple concept. We all do risk management personally. We think about risks. We have some way of analyzing, thinking about those risks. We try to manage those risks. So we all do it from a personal perspective. And today we're going to talk about how you do that from an organizational perspective. And if you think about the kinds of risks, there are risks that are threats to you accomplishing your mission. There are, bad things could happen where you could lose something of value, fire, theft, things like that. Or bad things could happen that would have some adverse impact on your operation. So those are examples of the kinds of, when I say risk is the possibility of something bad happening, those are sort of examples of things that could happen to an organization. The other thing you need to think about when it comes to risk is who are the stakeholders here? Because risk is not, it is risk. We're talking about organizational risk, but the consequences of risk could have impact on your clients, It could impact your staff. Think of health and safety issues. It could impact partner organizations. It could have an impact on donors. It could have an impact on the general population, the public. So when you think about risks to the organization as we go through this, you need to think about who are the stakeholders, and bad things that happen to the organization or in the organization could have an impact on many of these stakeholders. So if we think about what risk management is an ongoing process. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think the reason that most boards are not very comfortable around risk management is they only see it in piecemeal ways, and they don't have a sense that they have a handle on the overall risk in the organization. So think about it as something that is ongoing. It's a culture within the organization, which is another way to think about it. How the organization views risk, how they deal with risk is part of the organizational culture. Another way to think about it is a lens that you put on your organization. So you can put a risk management lens on the organization to think about what are the risks in the organization and how are you dealing with them. And risk management is a process. So those are kind of ways to think about what risk management is. So what it is not is a one-time exercise. This isn't something that you can do and just put on the shelf, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. Excuse me. And it's not somebody else's issue. Within the organization, risk becomes everybody's issue, and that'll become clear kind of as we go through this. So it's not a sometime thing. It's something that we do on an ongoing basis. It becomes a part of the board and staff process for how you deal with, how you manage, a part of the management of the organization. So any questions around kind of the big picture of risk? Can I see questions there?
Yeah, we'll give you a moment to enter any questions. Apparently there is not a hand to click. They may have updated the software since the last time I used it. So, but I do appreciate those of you who have mentioned that you can hear us clearly. Thank you for that. Okay. Any questions?
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions yet, so we'll just carry on. So let's talk about what is risk management. So risk management is an intentional, systematic process to manage risks, and there are really 4 steps. You need to identify the risks, you need to analyze the risk, you need to make some decisions about the risk, and then you need to monitor the risk. And when you think about it, those are kind of a generic 4 steps. If you think about personal risk, if you think about program risk, if you think about project risk, or you think about organizational risk, those 4 generic steps are really the same. You're talking about what are the risks, how do we think about those risks, what decisions do we have to take around those risks, and then how do we monitor those risks. And we're going to go through each of those steps and give examples and then talk about how we pull it together. So when we talk about identifying risks, it's easier to think about it if we think about them in big buckets or categories. So we're going to kind of first talk about what are the big categories of risk that organizations have, just because it's helpful in helping you identify the risks. Another thing to keep in mind is that risks will differ depending on the type of organization that you are and the types of activities you undertake to achieve your mission. You will have some risks that everybody has in common. For instance, you may all have a certain level of fraud risk, but then what that risk is and other risks will vary widely depending on the organization. Another example is if you're a charity, you might you would all have the risk that you're operating outside of the objects of your charity, The consequence of that would be that you might get your charitable status pulled. So that might be a common risk, but then you have to also identify what are the risks that are peculiar to your type of organization or your organization in particular. And the third thing to keep in mind is that risks change over time. Your organization changes, the kinds of things that you're doing changes, and the broader environment changes. So that's another reason that this isn't sort of a one-time exercise, because risks do change over time. So we're going to go through each of these categories of risk. Now, there are different ways of thinking about the big buckets or categories of risk, but I think these will work for most of you and certainly work as a good starting point. There's compliance, legal risk, there's operational risks, financial risks, reputational risks, risk to your reputation as an organization, and then a bucket that I've just called external risks. So we're going to go through each of these and give examples of risks that may be in your organization. And remember that this is just kind of a starting point. It's just to help you identify risks. These are not the risks, they're types of risk. So they're buckets to help you start to identify risk. So if we first look at compliance risk, there's really two types of compliance risk. The first risk is that you don't do something that you are required to do. So an example of that would be that you don't file your charitable return. So you have a risk that you don't file the returns that you need to file, and that's a compliance risk. The other kind of compliance risk is that you do something that you are prohibited from doing. So again, if I use charitable status as an example, the risk is that you operate outside of the objects of your charity. If you do that, the consequence could be that you get your charitable status pulled. So you have to think about what are the various kinds of compliance risk you have. You have different kinds of regulatory risk. If, for instance, you're a daycare, you have a whole set of regulations that you must comply with, which would be different than if you have a senior center. So you need to understand the regulatory framework that you have to operate in, and the risk here is that you, for instance, don't meet health and safety regulations. You have legal risks if you don't meet the terms of contracts or you don't meet employment standards. The other sort of kinds of risks you need to think about here is around your constating documents. It's just kind of a fancy term for the basic legal documents that form the basis of your organization. So that's your bylaws or your constitution, your letters patent, the basic legal documents that you have to operate within, so that you have a risk that you operate outside of your bylaws, for instance, and there would be consequences for that. So you have to, one thing to keep in mind here is to separate the risk from the consequence. So if I say the risk, for instance, is that I don't have access to my building, well, that's not the risk. The risk is fire or the risk is flood. The consequence would be that I might not have access to my building. So we need to focus on the risks. What are the actual risks in order to manage them? So these are one bucket to think about is compliance risk. The second bucket to think about is operational risks. So the kinds of operational risks that you have would really depend on what kind of operations you have, obviously, and would also depend on the kinds of clients that you serve. So it would differ quite a bit. So, for instance, you would all have some level of IT risks. You would have risks around losing client data or some kind of a security breach, and that the consequences of that would be quite different if the only client data you have is the client name and address. That's a quite different consequence than if I have the client name, address, phone number, financial information, and health information. That's a very different consequence for the organization and for the clients. But the risk is that, what's my risk around, what are my specific risks around losing client data or some sort of security breach? You have client safety risks, which would, again, differ depending on the types of clients that you serve and on the types of activities you undertake with those clients. You would likely all have some kind of HR risks around the Employment Standards Act and not complying with that, around your ability to attract and retain sufficient volunteers if you rely on volunteers. You would have real property risks. For instance, you could have risk of fire, risk of theft. And a type of risk here that I think boards really need to think about and don't spend enough time thinking about are capacity risks. And that's the risk that you can't attract and retain people with sufficient knowledge and training to do the kinds of things that you do. And capacity risks can open up in your organization that have an impact on the organization and the clients, and you need to think about what are those capacity risks. A good example would be if the executive director is retiring, that's going to open up a capacity gap, and there's risk around that, and we'll talk about how you're managing that risk. So these are the kinds of risks that you need to think about under operational risk. The next bucket is financial risks, which probably people are more familiar with. You have risks around funding and revenue. So you all have, maybe not all of you, a lot of you right now are looking at some risk around funding cutbacks. But you would also, for instance, have a risk around complying with your funder's requirements. So if you're not meeting the requirements of your funder, you have a risk around that, and the consequence could be that you lose funding. You could have risks around fundraising that would change or be different depending on what kind of fundraising you do. An example would be if you do fundraising through large events, which are costly, there's some risk around those events. You all have financial management risks like fraud. So there are lots of different, if you have significant investments, you have some investment risk. So you need to think about what are your financial risks. And the first step in risk management, again, is the first thing you need to do is identify what those risks are. So the next bucket is reputational risk, because your reputation is one of the key assets that you have as an organization. And there are a number of things that could impact your reputation. I have some examples here. Sometimes fundraising, if things go wrong, can have an impact on your reputation. If your clients aren't satisfied, programs can be a reputational risk. If staff morale is very low, risks around that. And if you're not performing well in partnerships that you have, many of you are dependent on partnerships to deliver services or achieve pieces of your mission. And if you're not doing partnership well, that can be a risk to your reputation. You have to think of sort of what bad things can happen that would have an impact on your reputation. And then the last bucket of risks is kind of external risks, which are things you really don't have any control over. They're just kind of out there. There's the risk of natural disaster, kind of storms, flooding, you lose power, things like that. Pandemic risk, so that, something like SARS would be an example. And I know after that, many organizations had to develop pandemic plans to deal with pandemic risk or terrorism. But these are, excuse me, that's kind of the last bucket to think about. So the buckets are just kind of to help you organize your thinking around what the risks would be. Any questions on identifying risk? That first step in the risk management process, Emily?
Not seeing any yet, but now would be a great time for participants to ask questions if you have any about identifying risk. You can enter them in the questions box of the webinar software.
So I've been asked, one of the things I've been asked here is about these categories, like could there be other categories of risk that people should think about? And yes, there are, but I think these 5 are a good starting point, and will help you start to identify. You may find as you get better at doing this that you want to adjust those buckets a bit, makes more sense for your organization, and that's fine. There's nothing magical about those categories. Well, I don't see any questions, so I guess I will carry on. So step 2 is, once I've identified the risks in the organization, I need to analyze those risks. And there's a couple pieces of information I need to know in order to think about those risks. I need to know what's the likelihood that that bad thing would happen. So how likely is it to happen? I need to know the consequence if it does happen. So if it happened, what's the consequence? And then the second is I need to know how severe is that impact. So I need to look and go through each of those and kind of think about how you analyze these risks. So the first thing I need to come to a decision on is, how likely is it that this would happen? And how do I do that? Well, I look at past experience. Has it happened before? Is a question you could ask. I would look at trends. Do I hear about it happening more or less? Have I heard about it happening in organizations like mine? I think about the environment. Do I see that risk happening? Do I think there are things happening that would increase that or decrease that risk? And in the end, it's a judgment call. It is, and it's sometimes it's a collective judgment of the board. Sometimes it's the judgment of the executive director or someone else on staff, but it is a judgment. And essentially what you do is you assign a risk or a likelihood rating to that risk. And I think for most of you, there are very fancy ways to rate likelihood. But I think if you just think about it in 3 categories of high, medium, and low, that will work at least for a starting point for you. So how likely is it? There are some risks that are very likely that it will happen. Some risks have a very low likelihood. So for each of the risks, the second step is to, the first part of analyzing that risk is to assign a likelihood to it, which is just a matter of thinking about the risk and making a judgment call as to how likely it is that that bad thing will happen. Then I need to know kind of what's the consequence if it does happen. So I need to think about if I lose my charitable status, or if I operate outside of the objects of my charitable status, the consequence is I lose my charitable status. It could mean I lose revenue stream because I lose donations. It could have a number of consequences. So it's to think about what is the outcome if that bad thing happened, and think about it not just in terms of the organization, but also in terms of what would happen to clients, to staff. So who is impacted if that bad thing happens? And just record, we'll see when we look at the risk management framework, making a note of what is the consequence if that were to happen. So that's the second piece of analyzing risk. The third piece would be to say, okay, how severe would that impact be? Which will differ widely by organization, even for the same risk. So if you had a security breach in your data, if that's the risk, The consequence would be different depending on what kind of data you have, what kinds of clients you serve, those kinds of things. And how it would impact your organization would be quite different. So you need to think about sort of what's the level and duration of any disruption you might suffer, what legal liability might be an issue. So what's the level of legal liability? What would be the financial impact if this happened? And then again, it is assigning kind of an impact rating to that risk. So if this bad thing happened, and it's high, medium, or low that it's likely to happen, then I need to think about, so if it does happen, what's the impact on the organization? And again, the impact is high, medium, or low. There are things that could happen, but they have in the end a very low impact on the organization. There are things that could happen that would have a very severe impact on the organization. So a part of what we do when we analyze risk is to say, okay, here's the risk, here's the likelihood that it's going to happen, and here's the impact it would have on the organization, because that helps me then kind of move into the next step, which is making decisions about that risk. So when I think about making decisions, so now I understand, I've identified the risks in my organization. I have assigned each of those risks a likelihood rating, and I have assigned each of those risks an impact rating. And now I have to make decisions about those risks and how the organization is dealing with them. And when you think about it, there are only 4 ways to deal with risk. I can avoid the risk, meaning I either don't start doing something because I decide I can't tolerate the risk, or I stop doing something because of the risk involved, because it's causing risk that I don't want. So you can avoid risk. You can transfer risk, at least in part. I transfer the risk of fire, the risk of theft through insurance. And some contracts will transfer risk to another party. So that's another way to deal with it. The third way to deal with it is control that risk. And that's what board policy is all about. Often I write a policy that says, okay, I'm going to take this risk, but I'm going to write this policy that says this is the extent of the risk we will take. This is how we will do it, so that I control the amount of risk that I'm taking. An example of that would be setting limits on the executive director and what decisions the executive director can make. It's a way of setting limits and controlling that risk. And then the fourth way that I can deal with risk is to manage it. I accept it, I'm going to live with it, but I manage it by developing processes that either minimize the likelihood or the impact. I do training of staff so that staff understand how to deal with this, and I do monitoring. When I think about it, most boards, the way they deal with risk is you write policy to control that risk. Policy and training are the 2 biggest pieces. And people forget about the process piece. The process piece is important because it's the processes in the organization that will help you, having common processes, having processes around how you do things are another key way of managing risks. So I can then look at the risks. Once I have assigned a likelihood rating to the risk, and I've assigned an impact rating to the risk, I can look at what I might want to do about that risk. And this is just a way of thinking about what you need to do. So if you have risks that you have decided it is highly likely they would happen, and they will have a severe impact on the organization if they do, that's the upper right corner here. You need to look at those risks, and there's kind of immediate action required there, and you need to control that. You can't just sit back and say, well, if it happens, it happens. And, if there is a high likelihood it happens and it has a severe impact, then that's from a governance perspective and from a management perspective, you need to step in and figure out how you control those risks and what can you do that either lowers the likelihood it will happen or lowers the severity of the impact. If it's highly likely to happen but has a very low impact on the organization, so the bottom right corner, that's often dealt with by developing processes about how we deal with it, how we manage it. The upper left corner, if it is low likelihood that it will happen, but it would have a very severe impact on the organization if it did, you might want to think about developing contingency plans around those things. So that's something like a pandemic. Maybe not high, like you may judge it's low likelihood that it will happen, but you might be required to or want to have a contingency plan around. So there are probably some things in your organization, and succession planning might be a good one, or how you think about if you were to lose a key management position, you might think it's not very likely that you will, but it would have a big impact on the organization if you did. So you want to think about what plans do you want to have in place to deal with that. So those are kind of the ways to think about risks. That's how you analyze risk in terms of what's the likelihood and then what's the level of impact, and then making a decision depending on the likelihood and the level of impact. So to pull all of that together, you can pull it all together in what's referred to as a risk management framework. If you're doing very complex projects, you might have something called a risk register. But it's a tool that allows you to pull this information together, have it in one place, and ensure that it is sort of updated and reviewed regularly. And there are a number of different formats that will work for this, but I'm going to propose a format here that I think is a good starting place. And again, you need a couple of key pieces of information. You need to have identified your risks. You need your risk and the ratings, so the impact. And then as you review it, you need to think about, is anything changed? Are you satisfied with the way you're managing risks? And if I go to this next slide, this would be an example of a risk management framework. So in the left-hand column, I have my buckets of risk. So my first bucket here is financial, and under that, I would put what are the risks in that bucket? What are the specific risks that I have in the organization? How do I rate the likelihood that that will happen? How do I rate the impact of that organization, of that happening? What is the consequence? So in that fourth column, what's the consequence if it does happen? And the last column is, what am I doing to mitigate that risk? So how am I managing that risk? And that records the decisions you've made about how you actually mitigate the risk to the organization. So it gives management and the board a way of looking at risk in a very systematic, kind of holistic way, rather than just kind of dealing with things piecemeal. And my bias is that the board should look at this risk management framework once a year and say, has anything changed? Would we change our likelihood rating or the impact rating? And are we, from an oversight perspective on the board, are we satisfied with the way the risk is being mitigated? And again, that's often through policy, that's often through training, that's sometimes through process. So it's a tool that you can use on an ongoing basis. And I think this is a good starting point for the tool. You may find as you get into it, there are other columns that you want to add. Often people will add a column for who is responsible for this risk. So under the financial risk, you might have your treasurer, your finance manager, whatever, so that you have a way of knowing kind of where primary responsibility for this risk sits in the organization. So before we go on, any questions about how I analyze risk, how I manage it?
We have a couple of questions here. I'll take one first about how do you identify weaknesses in board ability to run the organization? We are going to have another workshop and webinar late next month about board evaluation with Bill Sparks from Mass. He's here in the room. I don't know if he'd like to say anything about that.
It's a big topic, so we'll deal with it then. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and that really, to me, is the way that you deal with weaknesses on the board, and its ability to run the organization is really through how do you do board evaluation, which Bill's going to talk about at the next session and webinar. And it is something that all boards should be doing on a regular basis, is be doing self-assessments and looking at, are they up to the task? Are they providing the value to the organization that they should be?
Okay. And the other question is there a difference between operational risk and governance risk? And the person who asked that question gave a bit of extra context, saying each of our programs has a risk management plan, and now we are trying to elevate to the governance level to determine organizational risk or risk on the higher level.
Yeah, so there are differences. I think programs would fall under that bucket of operational risk. There are a couple of different kinds of governance, what I would call higher level governance risks. And some of them we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about the board's role in this. But when I think about it, there are strategic risks to an organization that a board needs to deal with. And that is often dealt with maybe through strategic planning. But it's also looked at, if you have funding, for instance, that you are dependent on, and that looks like it's at risk. Those are the kinds of things that would get elevated to the board level. There are also governance risks in terms of compliance is one place where there are governance risks. So the governance issue of, are you operating within the confines of the objects? If you're a charitable organization, are you operating within your bylaws? Is a governance risk. The risk is you operate outside of your bylaws, and I see that happen in organizations because directors aren't paying attention to what the bylaws say. They're doing things differently, and that can be a big risk over time, especially for an organization. So yes, I think there is clearly a difference between governance risk and operational risk, and responsibility for identifying those risks and managing those risks probably sits in different places in the organization. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. And that's all the questions we have right now.
Okay. So we'll move on to the last bit of this, which is the role of the board. So the role of the board in risk management is a couple things. The first role of the board is to lead by demonstrating good governance practices, including effective oversight. So, I said at the beginning here that risk management is a culture. If the board is not leading by demonstrating good governance practices, including providing effective oversight, if the board is not bringing value to the organization, that can create a culture in the organization that is very, let me say, dangerous for risk management, because they're not paying attention to risks, they're not paying attention to governance risks. The rest of the organization kind of falls in line and people aren't paying attention to risk. So the first job of the board is to make sure that they are leading by demonstrating good governance practices. There are also key risk decisions that go to the board. It could be a new activity you're undertaking. It could be a major contract that you're signing. But there are decisions around risk that are the board's to make that fall outside of what has been delegated to the executive director. As I mentioned earlier, there are strategic risks to the organization that are often dealt with through strategic planning. Strategic planning looks at the environmental risks, funding risks to an organization, and how the organization develops a strategy to minimize those risks and achieve their mission. It's the role of the board to kind of regularly review the framework and satisfy themselves, that risks have been identified, but also from an oversight perspective that risks are being mitigated in a way that they are okay with, and then to make sure they're doing things that they need to be doing around risk. Ensuring plans are in place to manage key risks, things like executive director succession plans, making sure things like that are in place. And then lastly, making sure there's a crisis management plan in place and that it works, which from a risk management perspective is critical. And then in terms of the role of management, it's management's role to flag risks for the board. You're much closer to operational risks, some financial risks, other risks, and flagging those risks for the board is really important. It's the role of management to promote a risk management culture so that everybody in the organization sees the role that they play in risk management. Developing the risk management framework, managing and monitoring risks, developing and implementing plans around key risks, and ensuring that board policies are implemented and followed. Those are all key pieces that management has to do in terms of overall risk management. Now, in terms of developing the risk management framework, I would actually suggest that you split it up within the organization, and you might have one person take a first look at the financial bucket, another person take a first look at the operations budget or bucket and what risks you have there. And maybe the board is looking at, board should be looking at the things, their compliance risks and things like that. So that's the difference between the role of management and the role of the board in risk management. So there are lots of resources out there on the internet that can help you do this. There are two organizations, Bloomberg's and Carter's, that both every year publish either or both of charity legal checklists and nonprofit legal checklists, which will probably scare you when you look at them, but they're very good in terms of thinking and helping you identify and thinking about the risks that you would run in an organization. And I put the websites there for Canadian Charity Law, which is where you would find Bloomberg's, and Carter's, the law firm where you would find Carter's. Certified Public Accountants Canada has a series of booklets. If you're a director, if you're not aware of them, that's a very good website. They have a whole series of booklets on 20 questions. So there's 20 questions directors should ask about marketing, 20 questions directors should ask about fundraising, 20 questions directors should ask about whatever, but they're all set up as 20 questions directors should ask. Then they do have one on 20 questions directors should ask about risk management, which is a useful resource for you. Imagine Canada on their website also has some very good stuff around risk management. So my summary thoughts in terms of risk management would be, if you take away from this, to understand that all organizations take risk to achieve their mission. So the object here is not to avoid risk. We just all go home and pull the covers over our head. But you need to take those risks intentionally and to manage the risks that you're taking. So all organizations need to have some form of risk management in place. And you may be a very low risk organization and your risk management, for instance, Mass is a very low risk organization. I did the first draft a number of years ago of our risk management framework. It took me about 2 hours, and I think even today it is less than 3 pages. And the board looks at that every year, and they say, okay, are we okay with the likelihood and impact ratings? Are we okay with how the risks in the organization are being mitigated? If I think about that versus a hospital, I mean, risk management looks entirely different. So it will look different in different organizations, but everybody should have risk management in place. And remember that risk management is often just common sense and good planning. And the trick is, that will take you, in some organizations, 100% of the way there, in some organizations, 90% of the way there. But it's important to, it is really common sense and good planning, but it's also important to remember where you need to tap into real expertise. So you may be an organization that really needs to tap into some cybersecurity expertise, as an example. Or you maybe need to tap into some financial expertise. Your auditor is always a great person to talk to when it comes to financial risks. So remembering that it is really common sense and good planning, but balance that with kind of knowing when you need to tap into expertise. I think the other thing, the takeaway is that it is everybody's job here. This is not the board's job or the staff's job or the executive director's job. Everybody has a role to play in risk management. And my last thought here is that it is everyone's job. So, I just said that, sorry. The last thought here, I'm getting near the end, is start the journey. So you're not going to be, if you don't today have a risk management framework and you want to put one together, it's not going to be perfect the first time you do it. This is something that you start and you will get better at it as time goes on. You will get better at knowing what the risks really are. You'll get better at analyzing those risks, and you'll get better at how you are mitigating those risks. So I would urge you to just make sure that you start this journey. And I think the risk management framework is a great tool to kind of get you started and thinking about the categories of risk that we talked about. So last chance. Any questions?
We do have one comment. Great webinar, thank you. One column I would add to a list of risks that need to be addressed would be timeline. In addition, who is responsible for that particular area should also be included to agree on a timeline.
Yeah, so timeline risk is a risk that certainly exists where you're looking at projects. Projects timeline, deliverable timelines can carry significant risks. So yeah, there are some risks where that may be really critical. For some of the other buckets, timelines may not be as critical, but that's a good point.
One more question. Among the resources shared, are there places we could view a risk management framework for another organization? So an example of a completed risk management framework.
So I'm trying to think whether the resources that I gave you, whether Imagine Canada or the CPA site actually has completed frameworks. But if you Google nonprofit risk management, you will get lots of examples of frameworks, and there will be some completed frameworks there. That would be a good thing to add actually to this presentation, is an example of at least a part of a framework that's been completed, and I don't have that, so I apologize.
It seems to me that would be very dependent on the nature of the organization.
It would be. So the actual risks and ratings and how they're mitigated would vary widely by organization. So it's not something that you can sort of copy, but it probably would give you a good sense of kind of how complete it was and the kinds of things people thought about when they put it together.
Okay. Do we have any further questions? We'll give you a moment or two to enter any questions. Other than that, just a couple of reminders. There is an applied learning session as part of the project coming up on board evaluation. Board recruitment. The applied learning session will be on board recruitment. That will be on Wednesday, June 19th. And the link for registration will become available on the Maximizing Governance website shortly. As we mentioned before, Bill Sparks from Mass will be hosting a workshop and webinar late next month on board evaluation. As always, I'd like to encourage everyone to sign up for and make use of OCASI's OrgWise organizational self-assessment tool. You can go to orgwise.ca, sign up for an account, and use the section on governance to evaluate the organizational health of your agency or group and to identify areas for improvement. There's also a large collection of governance resources there on orgwise.ca. One person has asked whether you can obtain copies of the slides. Yes, they are available in the handouts section of the webinar software. They will also be added to the Maximizing Governance website shortly. The website is at ocasi.org/maximizing-governance. If there are any further questions, we're happy to answer them. Otherwise, we will wind things up. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Okay, I'm not seeing questions, so thank you, everyone. If you have any further questions, you can email me, Mooney, Emily Mooney, Mooney, @ocasi.org. And I can also forward any questions you might have to Chris Govern from Management Advisory Service. I'd like to thank Chris for hosting this webinar. And it's been a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you very much.